Okay, so when we're playing draws, these are some of the key factors we want to think about. Um, First of all, obviously, is the strength of our draw. And I will talk about this in another slide in a little bit more detail, but basic things like how many outs do we have? Do we have overcards, or are there two pairs or trips that we can hit on the turn and river? And of course, is it the nut draw? Whether it's a nut flush draw or nut straight draw. Those are all things that are going to contribute to the strength of our draw. Of course, position is another key factor. I guess it's a key factor in any part of the game, but playing draws is no different. Having position, also having the betting lead, is also going to be a factor in how we play our draws. And I will break this down on future slides too, but we want to think about the immediate pot odds, so the odds that we have, the direct odds we have to call a bet, and then of course implied pot odds, which are the odds that we can potentially win on future streets. Of course, we want to think about our opponent's range, whether or not we have fold equity, or how much fold equity we might have given the opponent's range, the board texture, and I guess the amount of chips at play. Another thing we want to think about is the opponent's tendencies. So, are they aggressive? Are they passive? Are they a call station? Do they call down a lot or a little? In tournaments, this is sometimes pretty hard to decipher just because we don't have a lot of hands against most players, but it's still something you want to try and think about. And of course, stack depth. This one's pretty key, I'd say. Like, it's the difference between whether or not we want to maybe jam in our draw versus a C bet, or just flat call. If we're deeper stacked, maybe we don't want to get in, like 80 to 100 big blinds with a flush draw, even if it is like the nut flush draw. And yeah, so we'll break down some more of these points as we move on here in the slides and in the examples, of course. So we're going to talk more about the strength of our draw. So how strong is our draw? Many things contribute to the strength of a drawing hand in poker, and this is more complicated than simply calculating the amount of outs we have. So of course, when we flop a flush draw, we have 9 outs, 8 outs for an open-ended straight draw, 4 for a gut shot. I know this is really basic and obvious, but we'll go through it anyways. So other than just, calculating the amount of outs you do have, here are some other things you're going to want to think about when determining how strong your draw is. Like I mentioned before, do we have overcards that we can hit on the board? 2 pair or trips out, so maybe we flopped a pair and a draw, which, yeah, that's going to be significant there. Basically, are there other cards that can improve our hand other than, the flush or straight draw hitting? Another key thing is, are we using one or both whole cards for a draw? So say we have the ace of clubs and the flop comes 3 clubs. We do have a strong draw because, of course, we have the nut draw, but if we do hit our club, it's going to be a lot harder to get paid off when we do hit it. Same with if there's, a forward card straight on the board and we hit our straight. It's going to be pretty hard to get paid off by a worse hand. And then, as we talked about before, do we have the nut draw or close to it? I think this is pretty obvious, but having a nut flush draw is significantly more valuable than having lower flush draw combos. And obviously the reason for this is because when we do flop, say, a flush draw, some of the hands that are going to be in our opponent's range are flush draws as well. So if we have a low flush, there's always the chance, of course, that when we do hit our flush, we're not going to have the best hand because our opponent's going to have a higher flush than us. And of course, this also applies to straight draws. Obviously it's better to have the nut straight than, say, a bottom end straight. So I think that stuff's all pretty obvious, but they all factor into determining how strong of a draw we have and how we're going to play that draw. So move on here. So we will go over more of these, and I think looking at examples will show these differences a bit better than the slides, but just a few points here to go over. So here's some position and betting lead differences when we do play draws, and just stuff I've sort of thought about off the top of my head. So if we have the betting lead in position, it allows us to see bet our draws, and if called, we can choose to fire a second or third bullet, and that's assuming that we get check 2 on the turn and river. After the villain has acted. And when we're in a position, it also is going to allow us to take a free card on the flop or turn to control the pot size, and just a free shot at hitting a draw. Of course, when we're in position, no one can bet behind us, so once we're to act, if we check, that's the end of the street, of course. So we can, if it's something we want to do, we can always maybe check back our draw on the turn for a chance at a free card. Maybe we don't want to bet with the risk of getting check raised or check jammed, and then we, price ourselves out of a pot that we have a lot of equity in. So sometimes taking a free card is definitely going to play in our favor. So that was betting lead in position. Betting lead out of position, of course, we can still c-bet and have the opportunity to fire multiple bullets. But unlike being in position, we aren't really able to take a free card, obviously because there's an opponent to act after us. So we're at the mercy of whether he wants to check or bet, or she. But we are able to check raise any street, which can also be pretty valuable when playing a draw. Anytime we have we're at a reasonable stack depth, it's always a pretty good idea to put the last bet in, meaning say we check jam with a flush draw on the flop with, say, 20 big blinds. Now we have fold equity. We're not only relying on our direct odds to win the pot, we also have fold equity, so we can win the pot without showdown. Okay, so some other differences when facing a bet in position. So what I mean by that is we don't have the betting lead. So say we call the raise pre-flop on the button, so we're facing a bet in position. Of course, once we face a c-bet, we can call, raise, or fold to that c-bet. And of course, being in position, if we are check 2 on any street, we can take that free card or bet if we choose to do so. Okay. And the last one, so we are out of position and facing a bet, so maybe we call the raise from the blinds, or I guess that would have to be the case if we're out of position. And we'll take a look at a few of these examples. With most, well, I shouldn't say with most stack depths, but when we're deeper stacked, it can definitely be a pretty awkward way to play a draw. And obviously, being out of position, we can call or fold to a bet, as well as check raise. Or we also have the option of leading any street with a bet of our own, and that can get awkward, especially, maybe we call a flop and turn bet, and then we miss our draw by the river, and now our only option is to check give up or to lead with a bluff. Often this bet looks pretty awkward and a lot of times pretty bluffy, so Yeah, it's just awkward, and we'll go through some examples to show that in a little bit more depth. Okay, so we'll talk too about the difference between immediate odds versus implied odds. And I think this is fairly straightforward. Most of you probably have a pretty decent grasp on this, but just to go over it quickly. So immediate odds, this refers to the direct pot odds we encounter when facing a bet. So for example, a player bets 1,000 chips into a 2,000 chip pot, meaning there's now 3,000 chips in the pot and we face a bet of 1,000. So therefore 1,000 to 3,000 would be 3 to 1. So we are getting 3 to 1 immediate pot odds when we call. And this is going to be especially important when we face a jam on a given street or a shove. Then we want to calculate the price we're getting, so the pot odds, to see if our draw is going to be profitable or not to call off. And implied odds is something different. So this refers to the amount of chips we expect to win on future streets when and if we make our hand. So this is pretty much impossible to calculate exactly in every situation because, of course, we can't be sure of the betting action on future streets. You know, obviously, not every time when we hit our draw, not every time we're just going to stack our opponents. It's obviously not that simple. However, the type of villain and type of draw can increase or decrease implied odds substantially. So for example, if we know a villain to be super aggressive or a calling station, then of course we're more likely to get paid off when we make our draw, as opposed to, you know, someone who's pretty passive or tight, especially maybe folds to a lot of river bets. Then, okay, I'll read this in a sec. This is a long question. I appreciate that, but let me just get through this slide and then I'll go through that. So, so yeah, if a villain's we know to be tight or passive, you know, especially on the turn and river, then obviously that's going to decrease our implied odds because we're less likely to get paid when we do hit our draw. And also, more disguised draws can get us paid more often. So, like, probably the most disguised draw you could hit is like a gut shot. Obviously, we don't have as much equity with a gut shot, only having 4 outs, but when we do hit it, it's going to be really hard for our opponent to put us on that hand, and therefore he's going to be more likely to call us down. And this is opposed to say we make an open-ender with 1 whole card. So there's, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10 on board, and we have the jack, and we hit it. Obviously, it's going to be pretty tough to get paid by anything less than a jack, really. Maybe a 6 or, you know, a lower straight could pay us. But yeah, so that's that. The type of draw we have is obviously going to contribute to whether we have more or less implied odds in a given hand. And of course, just stacked depth is also a key factor. If there's deeper stacks, then we obviously have the opportunity to win a bigger pot. And, you know, say we call a 1,000 chip bet on the turn and the player's only got 500 chips behind, then, you know, for the river, then obviously the implied odds aren't very high because that player only has 500 left and we've already committed more than 1,000 just on the turn alone. So that's something else to think about with implied odds. Okay, so I'm just going to read through this quickly. I got a question: are multiplicative, it may be difficult to calculate odds during the game? Yes, for sure, it definitely is. And as we go through my examples, we'll see a lot of the mistakes I made multi-tabling. When we talk about implied odds, gives us formula to do it, but as I stated before, it's hard to do while we're playing. So here's my question: what's the best way to learn how to play on draws? Practicing flops or make them manually after the session? Yeah, I definitely think you're your question is very valid here. It definitely is very hard to, well, I mean, not just implied odds, but I mean, when you're playing, 10 tables or whatever you play, even, sometimes calculating direct odds when you have 5 other decisions to make can be a pain in the ass. So, yeah, I mean, I would say I haven't read Bill Chen's book, and I think it's definitely to calculate implied odds while you're playing a hand, especially multi-tabling, is going to be super complicated and challenging. So I guess you just have to try and do your best. And I agree with you to review hands afterwards in something like Flopzilla, which we will look at one example at least with Flopzilla today when we go through the hands. But yeah, I mean, going after the session and just reviewing the close plays that you had, that's definitely going to be beneficial for the future, because if you get in a similar spot, then you'd be like, oh, I remember this spot I looked at in Flopzilla. This one's pretty similar. This is going to be a fold, or this is going to be a call, or this is going to be a raise. So yeah, I overplay some of my draws, and that may cost me a lot. Yeah, it is. That can be a problem. I hope I don't think I answered your question very well, but it's definitely a concern for sure that I understand and I struggle with myself. But yeah, I think the best thing we can do is definitely review after the fact with Flopzilla and whatnot, and the other equity calculator, post-flop equity calculator. Okay, okay, no problem. And that is it for the slides. So we'll move into some hands now. Just going to, sorry, one sec, just got to get organized here. Okay, so now we're going to look at some hands that I have up saved on Hold'em Manager. So replay all. All right, so we will go through some examples now. So we get the old suited Jack 4, and we face a button raised 2.5x. When we're this deep, 51 big blinds deep, this is probably one we can probably just fold, toss away, and not get ourselves in trouble out of position. But, I mean, we are getting 2.7 to 1 on a call, so it can't be that bad. So now we see we are out of position, facing without the betting lead. And we flop a really strong draw, and the stacks are fairly deep at just over 50 effective. So we'll go ahead and, okay, so I decided to lead this one. And I usually don't lead a lot of hands, so I'm kind of surprised by this, but I definitely don't hate it. I think it's a good board. Obviously, we have a ton of outs. It's a good board to fire a couple bullets and maybe get our opponent to fold before we hit our draw. And we get called. And I think once we do fire that first bullet, we definitely want to continue firing. So we fire. We could have maybe bet a little bit bigger, but that's fine. I guess it's around 55 or 60% pot. And we get called again, and we finally hit our draw. So at this point, if we were to miss, I think I'd probably give up. I mean, Risky Soldier can have a ton of hands, especially if it was like an offsuit queen. That'd be kind of a terrible card to barrel a third time, I think, just because it doesn't change the board, and I think our opponent can have a decent amount of queens in their range, and they're not likely to fold to a king. So I wouldn't want to bluff a queen river if it wasn't a diamond. Well, bet a queen river if it wasn't a diamond. Obviously, we're not bluffing when we hit it. So yeah, we go ahead and hit, or bet once we hit, and we get a fold. And of course, stop me at any point if anything is confusing or you want to go over something with more detail. So now we're blind versus blind. Put in the raise with ace jack. We are fairly deep again in this one. So this time we're out of position, but with the betting lead. And we flop a gut shot. So blind versus blind, our opponent's range, when he calls our raise from the small blind, is going to be super wide. Therefore, we're going to want to be c-betting a lot of boards, especially ones with high cards, I think, because we can rep more high card hands than our opponent in this case. And of course, with a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw, I definitely want to be c-betting this board, blind versus a wide range. So we bet half pot, which I think is fine, and get called. So that's kind of an interesting turn. We picked up a flush draw, obviously, third nut flush draw. We still have the gut shot, but the king pairing the board doesn't exactly, I mean, I don't expect us to bet here and get folds very often unless you have like a gut shot or something on the flop. So this is kind of a tricky spot. I think I prefer a check and maybe just give up if it's a big bet, and if it's a small bet, then we can maybe see a river. There's a chance we do have the best hand at this point if he has like queen jack or I don't know, queen nine, something like that. So we do check and we face, yeah, a pretty small bet. It's a little bit over a third of a pot and we're getting 3.5 to 1. Yeah, this is kind of a tricky spot. I think I do want to call just because we do have some outs, obviously, and like I said before, there is a small chance, I'd say, that we have the best hand at this point. And it is a small bet. If it was over half pot, I'd just probably go ahead and give up. And we do hit our diamond now. I don't think there's much pointing in betting for value here. I think I'd rather, well, maybe that may not be true. If our opponent has a king, they're going to check that back a lot without a diamond, obviously. But I think it is going to be hard for us to get value from a worse hand here very often. And also, if we bet and our opponent jams, then we're going to be forced to fold. So I think I probably just like a check call here, unless he or she bets really big, that we might have to consider folding, of course. And he checks it down, and yeah, we did have the best hand on the turn, as you see. Just had ace high with the 8 of diamonds. So in that particular spot, maybe a value bet on the river would have got us a few more chips, but I think overall I do like checking that river back.